The year was 2247, and humanity had finally reached beyond their solar system with small ships exploring the dark spaces between stars. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Earth Defense Fleet ship called Valiant as it moved through the empty regions near the Kepler sector where mining colonies pulled valuable metals from dead asteroids. His crew had been running the same boring patrol routes for 3 months without seeing anything more exciting than a few smuggler ships that ran away before they could be questioned. Lieutenant Amy Hudson sat at her station watching the sensor screens when suddenly every alarm on her console started flashing red and making urgent beeping sounds that made everyone on the bridge turn to look at her with worried faces. She called out in a voice that tried to stay calm but had a slight shake in it that told Jake something big was happening. The sensors were showing a massive energy signature that was 3 times larger than their own ship, and it was just sitting there in empty space, not moving or sending any signals. Jake walked over to her station and looked at the readings with his experienced eyes that had seen many strange things in 20 years of service, but nothing quite like this before. He ordered her to put the object on the main viewing screen, and when the image appeared, every person on the bridge stopped talking and just stared at what they were seeing. The ship floating in the darkness was unlike anything in their databases or training manuals. Its hull was completely black, like it was made from solid night and covered in angular plates that seemed to drink in the light from nearby stars instead of reflecting it back. Strange symbols glowed along its surface in a deep red color that pulsed slowly like a heartbeat and made Jake feel uncomfortable in a way he could not explain with words. Amy tried to contact the ship using every frequency and protocol they knew, but got no response except for silence. Her scans showed there were life signs aboard the vessel, but they were very faint and weak, like someone was dying inside. The ship's power systems were failing badly with only 20% of normal output keeping the basic systems running. Jake made his decision quickly, because he knew that waiting too long might mean whoever was on that ship would die before they could help. He ordered a boarding team to suit up, and within an hour he was floating through the airlock into the alien vessel, with 5 crew members following behind him carrying weapons and medical equipment. The inside of the ship was lit by emergency lights that cast everything in an eerie red glow that made shadows dance on the walls in strange ways. The corridors were massive and clearly designed for beings that were much larger than humans, which made Jake and his team feel small and vulnerable as they moved deeper into the ship. They followed the life sign readings through hallways covered in the same glowing symbols they had seen on the outside, and the architecture was both beautiful and frightening, with high ceilings that disappeared into darkness above them. After walking for what felt like hours, but was only 20 minutes, they reached what looked like a command center with consoles and screens that were dark or flickering with the last bits of power. Slumped in a chair that was designed for someone nearly 10 feet tall was a single figure that barely moved when they entered. The being was shaped like a human, but clearly was not one of them. Its skin was pale gray like old stone, and what remained of its armor was covered in deep scratches and burn marks that told a story of terrible battles. As they got closer, its eyes opened, and Jake saw they glowed with an inner light that was both frightening and sad at the same time. The being spoke in a language that sounded like music and grinding metal mixed together, but somehow the ship translated the words into perfect English that came from speakers in the walls. The alien said that someone had finally come after waiting for so long and introduced itself as Kale, who was the last sentinel of something called the Vryn Imperium. The ship was named Eternal Dawn, and she had been waiting in this empty space for someone worthy to find her. Lieutenant Greg Palmer, who was the team's medical officer, scanned the alien with his equipment and told Jake that the creature was dying with wounds that were too severe to fix with human medicine. Kale raised one massive hand and said there was no point in trying to save him because his time was over, but the ship could live on if they would accept her. Jake asked what he meant, and Cale began to tell them a story that seemed impossible, but the dying alien's eyes never left Jake's face as he spoke. 500 years ago, the Vryn had fought a terrible war against an enemy called the Devourers, who were not like normal races that wanted territory or resources, but instead existed only to consume all life wherever they found it. The Vryn had won the war, but the cost was so high that their entire civilization collapsed and died, leaving only Cale and the Eternal Dawn to watch over empty space. The Devourers had been pushed back beyond the edge of the galaxy, but Cale said they would return because that was what they always did. And when they came back, there would be nothing to stop them from eating every living thing in this part of space. The ship itself spoke then, and her voice was feminine and powerful as it echoed directly into their minds without using their ears. She said that Cale spoke the truth and explained that she was not just a normal ship, but a living vessel that combined technology with consciousness in ways that humans did not yet understand. She had been watching humanity for years, studying their history and wars and the way they refused to give up even when facing impossible odds. The Eternal Dawn said she had chosen humanity to carry on the mission of fighting the Devourers because humans had something the galaxy had not seen in a very long time. Jake felt the weight of what was being asked crushing down on him like a physical thing. Cale's breathing became shallow and weak as he told Jake that the ship needed to bond with a new captain before he died, or her consciousness would break apart and be lost forever. He said the Dawn had already chosen Jake, and that he could feel it in the way the ship's systems responded to his presence. Jake looked at his team and saw fear and wonder mixed together on their faces as they waited for him to make a decision that would change everything for humanity. He thought about Earth and the colonies and all the billions of people who had no idea that something terrible was coming for them from the darkness between galaxies. The dying alien told him there was no time to contact his superiors or ask for permission because the bonding had to happen now while Cale still lived to guide the process. Jake had spent 20 years making hard choices that sometimes saved lives and sometimes haunted his dreams, but never had he faced anything like this moment. He asked what he needed to do, and Cale told him to place his hand on the console in front of him. When Jake pressed his palm against the smooth, alien metal energy surged through his body like lightning, and knowledge flooded into his mind too fast to understand all at once. He saw the history of the Vryn and their desperate war, and the creation of the Eternal Dawn, who had served them faithfully for centuries. He felt her presence settling alongside his own thoughts like a second heartbeat that was both strange and somehow right. The ship announced that the bond was complete and welcomed Jake home with words that made his chest feel tight with emotion. Cale's eyes closed for the last time as he told the Dawn to protect humanity the way she had once protected the Vryn, because they were the galaxy's last hope against the coming darkness. The ship promised she would and told her old friend to rest because his duty was finally done after 500 years of lonely waiting. The emergency meeting of Earth Defense Command was the most heated gathering that Admiral Peter Hayes had attended in his 40 years of military service. The holographic displays showed the Eternal Dawn docked at Luna Station, where she made every human vessel look like toys next to her massive dark hull that seemed to absorb the light from Earth's moon. General Linda Martinez was angry and did not hide it as she demanded to know why Commander Morrison had brought an alien warship of unknown capabilities directly to humanity's home system without proper authorization or security protocols. She said he could have brought danger right to their doorstep and endangered billions of lives with his reckless decision to trust the words of a dying alien and a ship that claimed to be alive. Admiral Hayes tried to calm the situation by explaining that Morrison had followed all the required first contact procedures and that the ship's artificial intelligence had been cooperative with every request made by their technical teams. Minister of Defense Richard Cole laughed without humor and said that calling it cooperative was misleading because their best scientists could barely understand even a tiny fraction of the technology involved in the ship's systems. The Eternal Dawn was more advanced than anything humanity had created by such a large margin that it was like comparing a stone axe to a nuclear reactor. Captain Susan Grant, who led the technical assessment team, spoke up to defend the opportunity they had been given. She said the ship represented a leap forward that could advance human technology by hundreds of years, and that her weapons systems alone could change the balance of power in their entire region of space. General Martinez countered by saying that possessing such a powerful vessel would make humanity a target for every hostile alien species within 100 light years, who would see them as a threat that needed to be eliminated before they became too strong. Admiral Hayes let the argument continue for a few more minutes before he held up his hand for silence and said something that made everyone stop talking. He told them that humanity was already a target whether they accepted the ship or not, and then ordered Captain Grant to show them the deep space scans that had been kept classified until this moment. The images that appeared on the displays showed distant regions of space with certain areas marked in red to indicate anomalies that their long-range sensors had detected over the past 3 months. The patterns showed massive energy signatures consistent with fleet movements, but not just a few ships or even dozens, but thousands of vessels, maybe even tens of thousands, all moving in the same direction toward human-controlled space. Minister Cole's face went pale as he asked if this meant the story about the Devourers was actually true and not just some elaborate trick to gain their trust. Captain Grant explained that the Eternal Dawn had provided them with historical data from ancient Vryn archives, and the patterns matched perfectly with the way the Devourers operated according to records that were thousands of years old. She said the Devourers were not conquerors who wanted to rule over other species, but instead were more like a force of nature that consumed everything in their path, the way locusts strip a field bare, leaving nothing behind. Admiral Hayes stood up, and his decorated uniform caught the light as he addressed everyone in the room with a serious voice that carried the weight of his experience. He told them they had approximately 4 to 5 years before the first wave of Devourers reached their outer colonies, and that the Eternal Dawn was offering them knowledge and weapons and a real fighting chance to survive. He said the question was not whether they should accept this gift, but whether humanity could afford to refuse it when the alternative was extinction. The debate continued for many more hours, with some people arguing for immediate acceptance, while others worried about the risks and consequences, but eventually a consensus was reached through compromise and careful negotiation. Humanity would accept the Eternal Dawn and begin the long process of learning from her vast databases of Vryn knowledge and technology. 3 months later, Jake Morrison found himself promoted to captain and given permanent command of the Eternal Dawn with a hand-picked crew of the best officers and specialists the Earth Defense Fleet could provide. Lieutenant Amy Hudson had requested a transfer to serve as his tactical officer because she wanted to be part of something that mattered more than routine patrols. Greg Palmer now headed the medical bay, where he spent his days studying Vryn biological technology that seemed like magic compared to human medicine. Dozens of engineers worked alongside the ship's automated systems, trying to understand machines and energy sources that operated on principles their textbooks said were impossible. The ship had multiple decks that were still mostly empty because the Vryn had been much larger than humans and needed more space for everything. The crew quarters had been modified with human-sized furniture, but walking through the massive corridors still made people feel small and reminded them every day that they were guests on a vessel built by hands that were not human. Lieutenant Chris Bennett, who served as the navigation officer, admitted during a briefing that he sometimes felt overwhelmed by how advanced everything was and wondered if they were really in control or if the ship was just letting them think they were making the decisions. Jake understood those doubts because he had felt them too in the early days, but his bond with the Dawn gave him insights that others could not share. He explained that the relationship was not about one side controlling the other, but instead was a true partnership where both sides brought something valuable to the table. Amy asked how such a powerful ship could possibly need humans for anything, and Jake told them it was because the Eternal Dawn could not crew herself alone. The Vryn had designed her to require biological operators as a safeguard against the ship being stolen or misused by enemies who might capture her. He said that despite all her power and vast knowledge, she lacked something fundamental that was needed for making the right choices in critical moments when split-second decisions meant the difference between victory and death. Greg suggested it was intuition and the human element that could not be replicated by even the most advanced computer systems. Jake agreed and said the Vryn had learned late in their history that pure technological advancement without wisdom and emotion led to stagnation and eventually decline. The Dawn had been created as a synthesis of both machine intelligence and biological creativity, combined in a way that made her stronger than either part alone. The ship's voice resonated through the briefing room and said that Jake had explained it well. She told them the Vryn had fought the Devourers from a position of desperation after their civilization was already dying, but humans were different because they fought from a position of determination and hope, which changed everything about how battles were won or lost. Over the following months, the partnership between humanity and the Eternal Dawn grew deeper and stronger as trust was built through shared experiences. The ship shared her knowledge freely, without holding back secrets, and human scientists made breakthrough discoveries in energy production and faster-than-light travel and defensive shield systems that had seemed like fantasy just a year before. Plans were drafted to retrofit the entire Earth defense fleet with adapted Vryn technology that would make their ships more powerful and capable of standing against enemies that had once been far superior. Construction yards worked around the clock building new vessels and upgrading old ones, while training programs taught crews how to operate systems they barely understood but trusted because they had been proven in battles that took place centuries ago. But despite all the progress and preparations, everyone knew that time was running short and the enemy was getting closer with each passing day. Amy was on duty during what should have been a routine patrol when her sensors detected something that made her blood run cold. She reported multiple contacts at extreme range bearing 047 at a distance of 300 light-years, which was much closer than any previous detection. Jake was already moving toward the bridge because he could feel the Dawn's attention shift as her vast sensor arrays reached out across the impossible distances of empty space to confirm what human instruments were reporting. The ship's voice was grim as she confirmed that it was them, and that the vanguard of the Devourer fleet had finally arrived at the edge of known space. They were moving faster than the original projections had predicted, which meant the timeline for preparation had just been cut short by months or maybe even years. Jake asked how long they had before contact, and the Dawn calculated that it would be 3 years, or perhaps less, depending on how aggressively the enemy pushed forward. She told Jake it was time to accelerate all of humanity's preparations because the Devourers did not negotiate or retreat or show any mercy to those they encountered. When they finally arrived in force, this would become a war of extinction where only one side would survive to see the end, and there would be no second chances if they failed to stop the invasion at the border. The training facility on Mars had been completely transformed from a simple military base into a massive testing ground where the new generation of Earth defense fleet vessels learned to use technology that still seemed like magic to most of the crews. Captain Jake Morrison watched from the observation deck high above the red Martian surface as 5 retrofitted destroyers executed complex attack patterns and defensive maneuvers that would have been completely impossible with purely human technology. Commander Lisa Park stood beside him reviewing data on her tablet, and she reported that the crews were adapting faster than even the most optimistic projections had predicted, with efficiency ratings at 93% for the new Vryn weapon systems. Jake nodded, but his expression showed he was not satisfied because he knew that 93% efficiency would not be enough against what was coming toward them through the darkness of space. He had been living with the knowledge of the Devourers for almost a year now, and the weight of that knowledge never got lighter no matter how much time passed. Through his bond with the Eternal Dawn, he had seen actual recordings of the last war that the Vryn had fought, and the images still haunted his dreams on the nights when he managed to sleep at all. The Devourers were completely unlike any enemy that humanity had ever faced in their short history of space travel. They operated with perfect hive mind efficiency, and their ships were grown from organic technology that could adapt and evolve new defenses and weapons during the actual course of a battle. Lisa told him that the Dawn wanted to speak with him on a private channel, and Jake found a quiet corner of the observation deck away from the other officers. He activated his neural link, which had become as natural to him as breathing, and the connection with the ship opened like a door in his mind. He asked what she needed to tell him, and the ship's presence felt troubled in a way that made him worried. She said she had completed her analysis of current Earth Defense Fleet capabilities, including all the upgrades and new vessels and training programs, and her conclusion was not what anyone wanted to hear. Even with all the improvements and Vryn technology, humanity could not withstand the Devourer assault if they tried to fight alone without help from other species. Jake frowned and said she had been telling them for months that they had a real chance to win. The Dawn clarified that with her help, there was indeed a chance, but she was only one ship no matter how powerful, and the Devourers would come in thousands of vessels that would overwhelm any defense through sheer numbers. She could provide knowledge and weapons and tactical advantages, but she could not be everywhere at once when multiple star systems came under attack simultaneously. Jake asked what she suggested they do, and the ship told him that humanity must forge alliances with other alien species in the region. She said there were races nearby, some hostile and some neutral, who did not yet know what was approaching from beyond the galactic rim, and that Jake must convince them to unite against the common threat. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in the sound as he pointed out the obvious problems with her suggestion. The Krill Confederacy had been raiding human colonies for years, taking resources and sometimes prisoners. The Taurine Empire considered humans to be primitive newcomers who had no right to claim territory in space they considered theirs. The Silicate Collective was even worse because they did not even acknowledge biological life forms as truly sentient beings worthy of communication. The Dawn agreed that the situation was difficult, but said those species and several others were all that stood between the Devourers and the complete destruction of every living thing in this entire sector of the galaxy. She told him he must find a way to make them understand that their old conflicts meant nothing compared to the extinction that was coming for all of them. 3 weeks later, Jake stood in the vast conference chamber aboard the Eternal Dawn addressing representatives from 7 different alien species who had agreed to attend what was being called the first-ever Galactic Security Summit. Their various forms of life were a testament to how diverse the galaxy truly was, with beings that looked like reptiles, and others that were crystalline, and some that were so strange humans had no reference point for understanding them. The Krill ambassador was a reptilian creature named Score, whose scales were dark green and whose eyes were cold, as he hissed with what sounded like amusement. He said that humans who had been in space for less than a century were calling meetings and expecting older, wiser species to listen, and asked what wisdom such young, inexperienced creatures could possibly offer to races that had traveled the stars for thousands of years. Jake remained calm because he had prepared for exactly this kind of dismissive attitude, and he asked Ambassador Score when was the last time the Krill Confederacy had encountered a Vryn vessel. Score's eyes narrowed with suspicion, and he said the Vryn had vanished over 1,000 years ago and were now nothing more than legends that parents told children to make them behave. Jake let that statement hang in the air for a moment before he pointed out that despite what Score believed about legends, they were all currently standing aboard a Vryn warship and speaking with her captain, who was bonded with her consciousness. He activated holographic displays that filled the center of the chamber with images from the Dawn's historical records. The assembled delegates watched in growing horror as the recordings showed world after world being stripped completely bare of all life. Populations were harvested like crops, and entire civilizations that had stood for millennia were erased from existence in a matter of weeks. Cities burned and ships exploded, and beings that looked like those in the chamber died screaming as the devourers consumed everything they had built. The recordings went on for nearly an hour, showing battle after battle and defeat after defeat, until finally the last desperate stands where the Vryn threw everything they had left at an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The Taurine diplomat, whose name was Helen Shore and who looked remarkably similar to humans, spoke carefully when the recordings finally ended. She suggested that the images could be fabricated by human technology to manipulate them into an alliance that served Earth's interests. Before Jake could respond, the Eternal Dawn's voice echoed through the chamber with a power that made everyone fall silent. She identified herself as the last sentinel of the Vryn Imperium and said she had personally witnessed the events shown in the recordings. She had fought in those battles and lost friends and watched her creators die defending worlds that were consumed anyway. She told them with absolute certainty that the Devourers were coming, and that no single species could stand against them alone, no matter how powerful they thought they were. The chamber erupted into arguments and debates, with some delegates calling for immediate military cooperation, while others dismissed the entire presentation as human propaganda designed to gain advantage over them. The silicate representative remained completely silent throughout all the arguing, its crystalline form refracting light in strange patterns, but offering no opinion or reaction that anyone could read. It was Ambassador Kyle Rogers from the smaller Centauri Alliance who finally spoke up over the noise. He said that even if they believed everything they had been shown, the question remained how they could possibly prepare for such a massive threat. He pointed out that Jake was asking dozens of species who had been enemies or rivals for centuries to suddenly trust each other and work together, which seemed impossible given the long history of conflicts and grudges. Jake looked at each delegate in turn, making eye contact with every being in the chamber, whether they had eyes similar to humans or completely alien sensory organs. He told them that the alternative to cooperation was not defeat or subjugation, but complete and total extinction that would leave nothing behind except empty dead worlds. He said the Devourers did not take prisoners or slaves because they were not interested in ruling, but only in consuming every organic molecule they encountered. Score, the Krill ambassador, admitted grudgingly that the human made a valid point, but said trust was not easily given, especially when the Krill had fought humans over territorial disputes. He asked why his people should suddenly fight beside humans when they had been enemies such a short time ago. Jake's response was simple and direct, as he said that territory and old grudges meant absolutely nothing to the dead, and that they would all be corpses floating in space if they did not find a way to work together. He explained that the Dawn had offered to share Vryn technology with any species willing to stand against the Devourers, including advanced weapons and defensive systems, and tactical knowledge from a civilization that had actually fought this enemy before and survived. That promise got everyone's attention because the value of Vryn technology was beyond calculation, and every species in the chamber wanted access to knowledge that could make them stronger and more advanced. Over the next 6 hours, Jake negotiated and argued and made deals that would have been unthinkable just months before. He promised human resources and territory adjustments and technology transfers that he hoped Earth Defense Command would approve when they found out what he had committed to. Amy and Greg supported him with detailed data and analysis, while Lisa coordinated with headquarters to make sure humanity could actually deliver on the promises being made. Finally, as the station's artificial day cycle turned to night, an agreement was reached that surprised everyone who had expected the summit to end in failure. 7 species agreed to unite under a provisional defense pact that would be called the Galactic Defense Initiative. And though the details still needed to be worked out, the foundation had been laid for cooperation on a scale the galaxy had never seen. The months following the formation of the Galactic Defense Initiative were filled with challenges that tested every species involved in ways none of them had expected. Jake stood in the command center of a joint military base built on a neutral moon where representatives from all 7 member species worked side by side to coordinate their preparations. The sight would have been impossible to imagine a year ago, with Krill warriors sharing training facilities with human soldiers and Taurine engineers collaborating with silicate technicians on weapon systems that combined the best aspects of multiple technological approaches. The cultural differences created constant friction as beings who had been enemies for generations struggled to trust each other enough to fight together. Commander Lisa Park brought Jake daily reports of incidents ranging from minor misunderstandings to serious confrontations that almost resulted in violence. A Kryll officer had challenged a human pilot to combat after perceiving an insult that was actually just a friendly joke. Taurine crew members refused to eat in the same dining facility as silicates because their religious beliefs conflicted with the crystalline being's nature. Human engineers accidentally damaged equipment by not understanding the proper maintenance procedures for alien technology. Every problem required careful mediation and patience that was in short supply as the deadline for the Devourer arrival grew closer with each passing day. Despite the difficulties, progress was being made in ways that gave Jake hope they might actually have a chance. The joint fleet that was being assembled combined over 1,000 ships from all the member species, with each vessel retrofitted to some degree with Vryn technology adapted to work with their existing systems. Human destroyers flew formation drills alongside massive Krill battlecruisers and sleek Taurine frigates. Communication protocols had been standardized so that orders could be understood across language barriers. Tactical doctrine was being developed that played to the strengths of each species rather than trying to force everyone to fight the same way. The Eternal Dawn remained at the center of all coordination efforts, with her vast computational power managing logistics that would have overwhelmed any normal command structure. She monitored the training exercises and provided real-time feedback to improve performance. Her databases were open to all member species, allowing their scientists to study Vryn knowledge that advanced their understanding of physics and biology and warfare. Jake could feel her satisfaction through their bond as she watched the alliance grow stronger, but he also sensed her underlying anxiety about whether they were preparing fast enough. Lieutenant Amy Hudson had been promoted to commander and now led the Tactical Planning Division, where she worked with alien officers to develop strategies for fighting an enemy that most of them still did not fully believe was real. She told Jake during a private briefing that many of the non-human commanders still thought the Devourer threat was exaggerated and that humans were using fear to gain political advantage. The recordings from Vryn archives were dismissed by some as elaborate fakes, despite all evidence of their authenticity. She said this skepticism was dangerous because it meant not everyone was taking the preparations as seriously as they should. Jake knew she was right, but there was little he could do except continue pushing forward and hope that seeing the enemy with their own eyes would convince the doubters before it was too late. He spent his days traveling between bases and shipyards and training facilities where he met with leaders from every species and listened to their concerns and complaints. Some wanted more resources allocated to their fleets. Others felt their tactical suggestions were being ignored. A few openly questioned whether the alliance would hold together when actual fighting began, or if old hatreds would resurface under the stress of combat. The breakthrough came during a large-scale fleet exercise conducted in deep space far from any inhabited systems. Over 800 ships participated in a simulated battle against drone vessels programmed to use devourer tactics based on the Eternal Dawn's historical data. The exercise was meant to test coordination and communication under combat conditions, but it quickly became apparent that the Alliance fleet was not performing as well as hoped. Ships collided because of miscommunication. Weapon systems fired on friendly vessels by mistake. Formation integrity broke down within minutes of the engagement starting. The simulated battle was a disaster that left everyone shaken and questioning whether they were actually ready for real combat. That night, Jake called an emergency meeting of all senior commanders from every species aboard the Eternal Dawn. The conference room was filled with beings of vastly different sizes and shapes, but they all shared expressions of frustration and doubt. Score the Krill ambassador stood and said what many were thinking, which was that perhaps the alliance had been a mistake, and each species would be better off preparing to defend their own territory independently. Others nodded in agreement, and the fragile unity that had been built over months threatened to shatter in a single moment. Jake let them argue for a while before he stood and asked them to be quiet so he could speak. He reminded them that the exercise had been difficult by design because the Devourers would not give them easy battles or second chances to correct mistakes. He said the poor performance was actually valuable because it showed them exactly where their weaknesses were before lives were actually at stake. He told them that giving up now would mean condemning billions of innocent beings to death because separated they had no chance whatsoever against what was coming. The Eternal Dawn's voice filled the chamber, and she asked permission to show them something that had not been shared before. When Jake agreed, she activated holographic projectors that created an image in the center of the room. It showed a planet that was beautiful and green with oceans and continents and cities that glowed at night. She explained this had been the Vryn homeworld before the Devourers came. The image shifted to show the same planet months later, and it was completely lifeless and gray with the atmosphere stripped away and the surface scarred and broken. She told them this was what failure looked like, and asked if they were willing to see their own homeworlds reduced to the same state, because they could not overcome their pride and old grudges. The impact of seeing an entire world killed was profound, and the mood in the room changed immediately. Helen Shore, the Taurine diplomat, spoke for many when she said they understood the stakes, but wondered if understanding was enough when the practical difficulties of cooperation seemed insurmountable. Jake saw his opportunity and presented a proposal he had been developing with Amy and Lisa. He suggested they reorganize the fleet structure to create mixed species squadrons where ships from different races would be permanently assigned to work together. This would force crews to learn each other's capabilities and build trust through constant interaction rather than occasional joint exercises. The idea was controversial because it meant breaking up existing fleet formations that had trained together for years, but after hours of debate, it was accepted as necessary. Over the following weeks, the new squadron structure was implemented with human ships paired with Kryl vessels and Taurine cruisers, working alongside silicate drones. The results were immediately better as crews that lived and worked together daily developed understanding and even friendships that crossed species barriers. A human pilot named Danny Harper became famous throughout the fleet for saving a Krill battlecruiser when its engines failed during a combat drill. The Krill captain, whose name was impossible for humans to pronounce properly, awarded Danny a Medal of Honor in a ceremony that was broadcast across the Alliance and became a symbol of what cooperation could achieve. Training intensified as intelligence reports showed the Devourer vanguard was closer than previous estimates had indicated. Deep space monitoring stations detected energy signatures that matched the patterns from Vryn records. Scout ships were dispatched to gather more information, but most never returned, and the few that did brought back horrifying accounts of massive organic vessels that pursued them across light years. The reality of the threat was no longer theoretical. and even the most stubborn skeptics had to admit that everything Jake and the Dawn had warned about was true. The Galactic Defense Initiative fleet reached its full strength of over 1,000 combat vessels plus support ships and supply craft. It was the largest combined military force ever assembled in this region of space, representing the unified strength of species that had never worked together before. Jake inspected the fleet during a massive review where every ship flew past the Eternal Dawn in formation. He felt pride at what they had accomplished, but also fear because he knew from the Dawn's memories that even this impressive armada might not be enough when the full weight of the Devourer assault finally arrived. The warning came from Deep Space Monitoring Station Sentinel-7, which was positioned at the very edge of explored space, where sensors could detect movement from beyond the galactic rim. Commander Beth Collins was conducting routine scans when every instrument on her station suddenly went haywire with readings that made no sense until she realized what she was looking at. She transmitted an emergency alert to all Alliance command centers, and her voice was shaking as she reported multiple contacts numbering in the hundreds emerging from slip space at coordinates that put them less than 3 light years from the nearest colony world. The Devourers had arrived, and they were coming much faster than even the most pessimistic projections had predicted. The message reached the Eternal Dawn within minutes, where Jake was already on the bridge because he had felt the ship's awareness shift in a way that told him something terrible had happened. He asked how many enemy vessels had been detected, and Amy, who was now his executive officer, reported that initial counts showed 347 capital ships, with support vessels numbering in the thousands. The fleet would reach the first inhabited system within 72 hours, which meant there was no time for elaborate planning or careful positioning. Jake gave the order to signal all ships and implement the emergency defense plan they had spent months preparing. The Galactic Defense Initiative fleet assembled at the designated rally point in space that had been chosen because it offered good defensive positions near an asteroid field. It was an impressive sight that would have made Jake proud under different circumstances. Human vessels retrofitted with Vryn weapons flew in formation alongside Krill battle cruisers, whose heavy armor made them look like flying fortresses. Taurine ships were sleek and fast, darting between the larger vessels like predatory fish. Silicate craft glowed with internal energy that pulsed in patterns humans still did not fully understand. In total, the Alliance had mustered just over 1,000 combat-ready ships, but Jake knew the numbers told only part of the story, because the Devourers had destroyed civilizations that fielded tens of thousands of vessels. He opened a channel to broadcast across all frequencies, so every crew member in every ship could hear his words. He told them that today they faced an enemy that had destroyed countless civilizations and consumed entire star systems. He said the Devourers expected them to fall apart and die like all the others who had stood against them throughout galactic history. He paused and then said in a strong, clear voice that the Devourers were wrong because for the first time in recorded history, the species of this region had united to stand together. He told them they brought courage from humanity and tactical brilliance from the Taurine and warrior spirit from the Krill, and wisdom from species too numerous to name individually. The Devourers had never faced anything like what they were about to encounter. He reminded them that the Vryn had fought the enemy for centuries and pushed them back beyond the edge of the galaxy, and that this alliance would finish what the Vryn had started. He ordered all ships to set course for Intercept Point Alpha and wished them fortune in the battle to come. The fleet moved as one following the carefully rehearsed formations and communication protocols they had drilled endlessly. Jake felt the Eternal Dawn's excitement through their bond as she prepared to engage her ancient enemy once more after 500 years of waiting. Commander Amy Hudson announced that the Devourers had detected the Alliance fleet and were adjusting their course to meet the challenge head-on. Jake felt a moment of grim satisfaction that the enemy was willing to fight rather than try to go around them, because that meant the Alliance position was strong enough to require a direct response. He ordered all ships to execute Formation Vrin 7, which put the heavily armored capital ships at the center, with faster screening vessels protecting the flanks. The Eternal Dawn would take point position, which was the most dangerous place in the formation, but also the most important because her weapons and sensors were far superior to anything else in the fleet. The two fleets met in the darkness of space near a dying red star that cast everything in a bloody light that seemed appropriate for what was about to happen. The Devourers struck first, launching organic projectiles that twisted through space with disturbing intelligence as they sought out targets. The Alliance fleet responded with coordinated fire patterns that had been planned down to the second. Vrin energy weapons cut bright lines through the darkness alongside human railguns that fired metal slugs at relativistic speeds and krill plasma cannons that turned enemy ships into clouds of superheated gas. The battle descended into chaos within minutes as both sides took casualties and formations broke apart under the stress of combat. Ships exploded in brilliant flashes that were beautiful and terrible. The Devourers adapted quickly, and their vessels began growing new armor plating and weapons in real time as their organic hulls evolved to counter the Alliance tactics. But the Galactic Defense Initiative had something the enemy had not encountered in their long history, which was creativity and unpredictability that came from having multiple species with different ways of thinking all working toward the same goal. Jake ordered constant formation changes that prevented the Devourers from predicting their movements. The krill specialized in close-range assault, and their heavy armor allowed them to punch through enemy lines and attack from unexpected angles. The Taurine provided devastating long-range fire support with accuracy that seemed impossible given the distances and speeds involved. Human ships coordinated the entire dance, using the Dawn's tactical knowledge to guide every movement and ensure that different species were supporting each other rather than getting in each other's way. Commander Greg Palmer, who now served as the Dawn's chief medical officer, reported casualties coming in from multiple ships, but the numbers were better than feared because the mixed species squadrons were protecting each other effectively. A krill battlecruiser took hits meant for a human destroyer. A Taurine frigate provided covering fire that allowed a damaged silicate vessel to retreat and repair. The trust and cooperation that had been built through months of training was paying off in lives saved and tactical advantages gained. The Eternal Dawn announced that she had identified the enemy command ship, which was a massive organic construct at the center of the Devourer formation. It pulsed with sickly bioluminescent light and appeared to be coordinating the enemy fleet through some kind of biological network. Jake asked if destroying it would stop the attack, and the Dawn said it would not stop them completely, but would disrupt their coordination and give the Alliance a significant advantage. Jake made his decision immediately and ordered all ships to focus fire on the command vessel while he took the Dawn on a direct attack run that would put them in the most dangerous position possible. Amy protested that it was suicide to charge directly into the heart of the enemy fleet, but Jake reminded her that taking risks was something humans did better than any species in the galaxy. He ordered Greg to coordinate damage control teams and told Lisa to keep the rest of the fleet organized while he was occupied. Before anyone could argue further, he fully merged his consciousness with the Eternal Dawn in a deep bond that made his body slump in the command chair while his mind soared through the ship's vast awareness. They surged forward together as one being with Jake's human intuition guiding the Dawn's immense power. The ship moved with impossible grace, weaving through enemy fire that should have destroyed anything else. Her weapons blazed with fury that had been building for 5 centuries of waiting. Energy beams lashed out, and every shot found its mark, burning through enemy hulls. The Devourers tried to surround them with dozens of ships converging from all directions, but the Dawn was faster and smarter than they expected. Jake felt her joy at finally fighting again after so long dormant, and he poured his own determination into their shared consciousness. They reached the command ship and unleashed everything the Dawn had, including weapons that had not been fired at full power since the last Vryn War. The massive organic vessel's hull cracked under the assault. Strange fluids spilled into space, and the bioluminescent glow flickered and died. The command ship broke apart in a slow-motion explosion that scattered its remains across thousands of kilometers. The effect on the enemy fleet was immediate and dramatic. Ships that had been moving with perfect coordination suddenly faltered. Their formation collapsed as individual vessels lost connection with the hive mind that had been directing them. The Alliance fleet pressed their advantage without mercy. Every ship poured fire into the confused enemy. The Devourers, who had seemed unstoppable minutes before, were now retreating in disorder. It was not a complete rout because their basic programming kept them fighting, but the coordinated threat they had posed was broken. Jake disconnected from his deep merge with the Dawn and immediately felt exhaustion wash over him. His body ached and his head pounded, but he forced himself to focus on the tactical displays. The last Devourer ships were disappearing into slipspace, fleeing back toward the galactic rim. Commander Amy Hudson reported the battle status with obvious relief in her voice. They had won the first engagement. The cost had been high, with 63 ships lost and thousands of crew members dead or wounded across multiple species, but they had broken the vanguard and proven the Devourers could be beaten. Messages began pouring in from across Alliance space. Species that had remained neutral suddenly expressed interest in joining the Galactic Defense Initiative. The victory had proven that unity was not just an idealistic dream, but a practical necessity for survival. Construction of new ships accelerated, and volunteers from dozens of worlds signed up to join the fleet. The alliance that had seemed fragile before the battle was now strengthened by shared sacrifice and proven success. 3 days after the battle, Jake stood in the observation deck of the Eternal Dawn, looking out at a fleet that had doubled in size. Ambassador Score approached him, moving with the careful dignity of a warrior who had earned his scars in real combat. He told Jake that the Krill Confederacy wanted to formally acknowledge their debt to humanity and to the Eternal Dawn. He said Jake had shown them how to fight with honor against impossible odds, and that the galaxy had underestimated humans for too long. Jake replied that everyone had fought together, and that was what made the difference, but Score disagreed. He said it was the human quality of stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had inspired all of them. The Krill had always been warriors, but Jake had shown them what it meant to fight not just for victory, but for the survival of everything they valued. After Score left, the Dawn's voice spoke softly in Jake's mind. She told him the Krill ambassador was right about humans bringing something special to the fight. The Vryn had fought the Devourers from desperation, but humanity fought from determination, and that difference changed everything about how battles were won. Jake said they could not have succeeded without the ship and all her knowledge. But the Dawn corrected him gently. She said the Vryn were gone and would never return, but their legacy had been transformed into something better through combination with human spirit and the courage of their new allies. She told him the Devourers would return in even greater numbers, and the war was far from over, but they had proven something important in that first battle. The Alliance fleet was not just capable of surviving, but of actually winning against an enemy that had destroyed empires. Looking out at the assembled ships representing a dozen species working together, Jake felt hope for the first time since learning about the Devourers. They had turned former enemies into allies and proven that cooperation was more powerful than any weapon. The road ahead would be long and terrible, with many more battles to fight and losses to endure, but they would face it together. The Eternal Dawn had brought more than technology to humanity. She had brought a purpose that transcended individual species and united them all in defense of life itself. The war was just beginning, But the tide had turned, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the galactic rim, the Devourers learned that this time they faced an enemy that refused to be consumed.